I'll now pass over to Anu for the first set of discussants' comments.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And thanks very much for this opportunity to comment on this very interesting piece of work. I think it's really timely that this has come out because it really does a very nice stock take, not so much the World Bank portfolio, but more of the broader literature on the subject. And I think increasingly there's been an interest in the impact of these interventions. Till very recently, there was a lot happening in just piloting and describing the experiences with social accountability. But now there's a very focused interest on impact, and that I think is really important. I think one of the points that you leave with is one of the key issues is that we need to build the evidence base. And the two key issues that are raised by many of such reviews of looking at the evidence base that exists, limited as it is two things. One is what are the contextual factors that enable some of these interventions to work in some contexts and not others. Mm-hmm. We know, for example, that information campaigns work in some situations. Mm-hmm. We have two contrasting examples from India itself in your report. And the question is then what are those factors that make it work in one context and not the other? So greater attention to the contextual factors. Your report actually highlights some of the things that might be important, but a more systematic look at the contextual factors would be quite significant. Capacity of civil society organizations, the media, the political context, etc. So I'm going to point to that. The second issue I think that's really important is the processes through which these particular interventions are expected to have impact. So tracing some sort of a theory of change and then assumptions behind that theory step by step to lead to the eventual outcomes that you're expecting, which is ultimately improved service delivery. So I think looking at those is really quite critical. And I think your report sort of traces some of them, but not unpacks entirely the chain, the causal chain behind each kind of intervention, which would be quite useful to have, so that when you're evaluating impact of such interventions, you can see how far down that chain a particular intervention is actually able to go, even if it might not have impact on the ultimate outcomes. I think in terms of assessing impact, one of the most useful things in the report I found was the appendix on the constraints and problems in actually assessing impact, which is Appendix 1, and the potential ways in which these issues might be resolved. To me, I think we've been doing some work on social accountability and how social accountability might have impact. And one of the key issues is how we actually define the intervention. Because these interventions, although you might label them as the same thing, social audit or report card, scorecard, they actually unroll differently in different contexts. And so how you actually define them is quite different in different places. And I think the approach that you suggest here much more fits with the experimental approach, the randomized control trial approach to building up evidence. And a contrasting approach is actually looking at, because I think a lot of the social accountability interventions that have been successful are a product of political engagement in the long term over a period of time by particular actors in their domestic sort of politics. For example, the right to information in India, which is cited several times in the book, is a product of a particular long-term engagement of the MKSS in trying to get this law passed in the first place. And some of the research that we've been doing in India shows that actually sort of being involved in the producing of these laws, for example, this right to information, impacts how these laws get used later on. So that groups that are networked into policymakers who are making the law are more likely to use the law. And this has been shown quite usefully in the right to information case. So I think one of the key things that's important and we need more research on in social accountability to reign in the first place is under what conditions do social accountability actors, citizens, civil society organizations, media groups, under what conditions do they actually take up this task of holding providers to account. We don't actually have a good understanding of these issues, and that I think has to do with the politics of long-term engagement with the state. It's not so much just intervening by creating a report card or anything like that. So I think it's important to start seeing how we define these interventions. I know, for example, different civil society organizations are taking up this task quite differently. I'll give you two examples. One is the International Budget Project, which is looking at budget advocacy work, and they've started categorizing interventions not so much in terms of these mechanisms like social audits, but in terms of the tasks that civil society organizations undertake. And the reason why this is important, I think, is that civil society organizations that are undertaking these sorts of social accountability engagements have to make a choice. Do you sort of start demanding information and using information? Should you invest in a media campaign? What is the right strategy to use? And understanding the impact of these strategies separately and collectively, I think, seems quite important. Okay. So, and another example of an organization that's looking at this issue quite differently is Twaweza in Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, that's been also working on citizen advocacy to improve services. I won't go into detail of what they're doing, but those are just two examples. Okay, so sort of having laid that sort of importance of looking at the politics and the context and the processes rather than just at the outcomes are important. And in terms of outcomes, quickly to say that I think you need to sort of unpack what kinds of impacts you're looking at. Obviously, one of the key impacts is improvements in services themselves, health, education, etc. But there are two other impacts that could be intermediary impacts and equally important. And one part of that has to do with the changes in behavior of providers, and the other has to do in changes in behavior of the citizens, users, civil society groups. And sort of looking at those impacts also seems quite important. I'll just end my discussion comments saying that the two things that the book points out, which I think are really important and fruitful avenues for further research. One is the whole issue of social inclusion. A lot of the literature on social accountability actually doesn't take up the issue of social inclusion. Who gets included and who gets excluded? We did a little bit of a quick review of looking at the impact studies, and there isn't any systematic evidence saying, both in terms of who gets included in the process of using these social accountability mechanisms, and also who gets included or excluded from the impact, if they have any. So if services get improved, do some groups gain less from the improvements than others? And so to look at that more critically would be quite important. The second area I think that's very fruitful in terms of research that you've already mentioned, but I'll flag again here, is the use of new technology. And I think the use of new technology is quite key because it can potentially overcome, allow real-time integration of things like grievance redressal, use of information, use of channels to demand information, etc., with the management of the delivery process, so that you don't have this sort of separation of the grievance channel and then how it goes through and then feeds back into the delivery channel. We have a couple of examples from India that people are starting to do research on. Now one has to do with the public distribution system, which is a food subsidy program in India, which is using both GPS technologies, online information about where food is sent, as well as mobile text messaging to ensure that the procured food actually reaches the point of delivery and groups can actually demand the food as and when it comes in. Another example is from the garbage disposal, waste disposal in the city of Hyderabad, where mobile cameras and text messaging technology is used to see whether certain services have been provided or not in particular locations, and automatically feed back into the management process. So I think those two areas would be quite useful to do some further research on, and I'll end there, but it's a good contribution to a growing sort of important field. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Anu.